Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Ganesh. This is going to be how I generally approach building Ganesh. And I'm choosing to do Ganesh next because he is in fact my favorite god to build Gauntlet of Thebes on, and considering I just recently finished talking about Gauntlet of Thebes, I wanted to sort of give you an example. So just kind of a forewarning ahead of time that Gauntlet of Thebes will come up. And again, it is unusually effective on him. Now, it's unusually effective on him very specifically due to his passive good fortune. Ganesh, basically, to summarize this, doesn't get kills unless he is very much alone. Like, way out in East Timbuktu, by himself, no allies nearby, alone. This is a good thing for him as a support, because essentially this means that stacking certain items is incredibly easy to do on him, Gauntlet of Thebes being the big example, but there's one other one that I'll talk about. But Gauntlet of Thebes is incredibly easy to stack on him because you, of course, need assists with Gauntlet of Thebes to stack this. And unlike every other support in the game who runs the risk of accidentally killing some minions and generally will kill one or two minions when clearing the wave, as long as enemies are there, that doesn't happen with Ganesh. So you are guaranteed to stack this as quickly as possible as long as you're not spending too much time wandering through the jungle. Alright? As a result, I will typically throw Gauntlet of Thebes on in more situations with Ganesh than I would with a lot of other Guardian supports. However, there is far more to Ganesh than just this. In fact, Ganesh does fairly well, unusually well in fact, with a sort of damage-minded build. Now, when I say damage-minded, that is very different from saying build full damage, right? Don't do that. That's going to get you killed and your allies are going to lag a frontline. What I mean by that is, because of the way items are currently in the game, Ganesh has a variety of really interesting ways of helping his allies kill enemies a hell of a lot faster. This is partially due to two of his abilities, the first one being Turn of Fate, which in fact actually provides a potentially very impressive damage buff to his allies. And this is just incredibly useful in a team fight. You hit a couple of people, you're giving your allies a 4, 6, maybe even an 8% damage bonus. If you're fighting in lane and you can hit a minion wave, that's guaranteed 10% bonus damage, which is really impressive, right? Combine this with the protection reduction effects of Dharmic Pillars, and you can really understand how significantly Ganesh can deal damage to enemies by himself, but even more important is how much damage he can boost his allies' damage by, right? A 10% damage boost plus a 55 protection reduction, which is going to wipe out almost all the protections of anything that isn't building a tank. It doesn't have at least one protection item, right? Which is most hunters, most mages, some assassins. It depends on the assassin. They're starting to splash in the occasional protection item, but mages and hunters are just going to be absolutely, completely protectionless, or at least very nearly so, to the point where your allies will practically be doing true damage to the enemy ADC in mid lane, and substantially more amounts of damage to assassins who, even if they do splash in protections, are unlikely to have so many protections that they're going to have very high protections after the fact. So through these two specific methods, Ganesh actually can bring to bear a really impressive amount of boosted damage to his allies. Despite that, however, you still don't want to necessarily be starting out with a lot of damage, and this is actually one of the reasons why I'm more likely to build Gauntlet of Thebes. Gauntlet of Thebes, as I've stated previously in various videos, is currently the most powerful protection item in the game. When this is fully stacked, you, as a support, are getting 65 of both protections and 250 health. There is no other item in the game that gives you this many defensive stats in these amounts, right? 65 of both protections and 250 health is huge. And it's very important for Ganesh because at the end of the game, you are probably going to want to splash on some form of damage boosting item, which I will get into in a bit, to really emphasize your ally's damage. So Ganesh, what makes Ganesh dangerous is not just the fact that he's got a surprisingly long-lasting silence in his ohm, a silence that he can run for nearly 2 seconds, right, with an impressive 10-second cooldown default, but also a this is defined as a knockup. It's really more of a route into a knockup in actual function, for reference. All right, basically. But he's got these two very powerful forms of crowd control. There's a slow attached to the very same lines that reduce protections, right? Which is, of course, devastating. And Turn of Fate, while it doesn't do any crowd control, is, of course, doing that increased damage. So Ganesh's passive, providing you with guaranteed assists, is hugely powerful. So a lot of the times I'm running Sentinel's Gift, and I'm running Sentinel's Gift most of the time because, again, you are talking about not missing a beat on those assists, and generally speaking with Ganesh, and Ganesh is one of the very rare Guardians I'll do this with, I will almost always go with Sentinel's Boon, because you are almost always guaranteed that lovely assist, which means 4% of your health and mana being restored. Right, the gold, by the time you've built Sentinel's Boon, very likely the gold isn't that important. But the healing and the mana are both fairly impressive, and the 20 MP5 from this doesn't hurt either, right? Obviously, you get that with Sentinel's Embrace as well, but combine that with a nice 4% healing or 4% restoration of mana with each assist, and you can really see, I mean, in a standard team fight, even in the jungle, assuming no jungle minions die in the process, you're still talking about a really impressive 20% reduction of your health and mana over the course of the battle in 4% increments as enemies die, in a perfect world. Right? So a lot of the times I am running Sentinel's Gift. It is incredibly powerful on Ganesh, even if your team tends to include a lot of auto-attackers, even when you compare that to, say, War Banner, which isn't giving you nearly as much. That is only a 1.25%. That is, I think that totals up, if I'm doing my math correctly, 6.25%, which is not nearly. That's only after, actually, excuse me, 4 more stacks. Pardon me, I forgot. That's only going to be, for every team fight, 1.25% of your health and mana. So when you compare that to the guaranteed nature of Sentinel's Boon in Ganesh's specific case, now this comparison becomes different for every other support in the game because you're not guaranteed that assist. But with Ganesh, you are guaranteed that assist, unless you're the last man standing in a team fight, which is rare, because you're the support, you're tanking the damage, you're the front line. You really shouldn't be the last man standing. So Sentinel's Boon is hugely impactful with Ganesh in a way that it isn't on literally anyone else in the game. So a lot of the times, again, I will go into that Gauntlet of Thebes, which is a really great time. Now, I am going to temporarily, just so that you can see the full protection stacks here, run Mantle Discord, because it has 55 of each protection. It'll be a simulation. You'll see towards the end of the game. What game? You'll see towards the end of the conversation, but I'll usually run into Gauntlet of Thebes, right? And then, now it's time for our next protection item. Now, what this protection item is really depends for me, because there's a lot of really interesting choices that you have on offer. All right. In a lot of cases, since I have already built Thebes and I am intending to provide my allies with that aura, in most cases, I am usually going to run a delightful. Sometimes I'll build Sovereignty if the enemy team is damaging enough, which a lot of the times they are. Again, the 3 physical, 2 magic comp generally justifies this. You get your allies 25 physical protections from the combination of the auras. It's a really lovely time. If you're more aggressive or you're feeling just like your team needs a little bit more magic damage, which can catch enemies off guard, Mystical Mail isn't an entirely bad idea. Because, again, keep in mind that you're increasing not only your own damage, but you're also decreasing enemy protections. So this actually can slap a little bit harder, and sure, yeah, it's 40 magic damage a second, but that's 40 damage a second reduced by the enemy protections. But if they don't have protections and you're increasing that by 10% potentially, you're looking at around 44 true damage a second for however long the protection reduction from the enemy is going to last. It depends on when they die. And while it's not a ton, it does make a visible difference in most matches, especially if the enemy team is squishier, right? Like I said, hunters and mages are going to have 0 protections or the next best thing. So Mystical Mail can actually inflict some really impressive damage, and once again, with most supports, you would have to be concerned about accidentally stealing a kill with this, but this is not a concern with Ganesh. So you can pretty much freely add damage to the team fight en masse with Mystical Mail, especially in late game team fights where you're hitting multiple enemies with this per second potentially. And you will find that in a lot of cases, Mystical Mail can be quite the really devastating addition to your build. It really is going to depend because, again, both Mystical Mail and Sovereignty are really great items against higher damage, lower defense compositions. This is going to come down to how aggressive you are individually. If you're a more aggressive player, then maybe Mystical Mail would do you a little bit more good. If you're a more passive player, then your allies are more likely to be in a position where they will get the benefit of your sovereignty. So that might be the slightly better choice for you. So whether or not you go Sovereignty or Mystical Mail is going to depend. Also keep in mind your team composition. If you have a bunch of tanks on your team, Mystical Mail is going to be the better idea because, of course, if your allies are all tankier, that means they're going to be hitting a little less hard in the late game, and you're going to need something to make up for that, and Mystical Mail will help you with that. Now, if during your stacking of Gauntlet of Thebes or building of Gauntlet of Thebes, your team starts really falling behind, you've taken some tumbles, your team is struggling, then it might be worth grabbing Emperor's Armor first. Again, we're talking about the reduction of protections. While obviously Turn of Fate isn't going to boost the tower's damage because it's not an allied god, the reduction of protections that your ult can bring, combined with the silence and your route into pop-up, again, that's just how I consider it. It's not literally a route into pop-up, but it plays like a route into pop-up. But regardless, with your crowd control plus your ult, you can actually get the tower to inflict really substantial amounts of damage using Emperor's Armor. So again, if you're behind, if your team is really struggling, Emperor's Armor is an unusually powerful item on Ganesh in that particular instance. You will be able to defend your towers a lot better than you might expect given the circumstances with the benefit of Emperor's Armor. So usually I'm building something out of this tree. Every once in a while I'll build Midgardian Mail if the enemy team composition happens to have that many auto attackers, which is rare, but it does happen sometimes, in which case, yeah, I'll go into Midgardian Mail, mostly because I really like how Midgardian Mail can combine with other methods of slowing, right? It can stack with other item slows, really lovely time. I'll usually throw on a 5th item, Witchblade. Goes really great with Midgardian Mail. It makes you very difficult to take down for auto attackers. So there is the occasional match where I'll build Midgardian over these other great options. But a lot of the time I'm going either Mystical Mail or Sovereignty. For me personally, it really does depend on the team composition. The squishier my allies are, which is, again, the sort of standard, I'm usually going Sovereignty. If my team composition is a little tankier, I'm going for that Mystical Mail. Okay, but this is, I'm almost always building something out of this tree. Now, there is a very rare exception, and that rare exception is if the enemy duo lane I expect to be 2 magics, a magic ADC and a guardian support, or the enemy team comp has 4 or 5 magic damage sources. In that particular case, I will very specifically go with the amulet, the Heartward amulet. But with that one very rare exception, and again, in Conquest, that's very rare, I'll go with that then. But yeah, usually I'm going with something out of the Steel Mail tree. Or actually, the steel mail tree, I'll just call it. So my fourth item is going to usually be the magic protections, right? At this particular point, again, assuming that magic damage isn't the enemy team's focal point. And for this, I'm going to go one of two ways. If I have enough magic damage on my team, a classic example is I have a magic damage solo lane, which is the usual suspect, or Ao Kwang as my jungler. I'll go Void Stone because that's going to decrease the enemy's magic protections. My solo lane, my mid lane, and or my jungler. Again, if my jungler is Ao Kwang or someone else magical, they'll be hitting a little harder, which is great for them, right? So this is really conditional specifically to my team composition. More magic, Void Stone. If my team does not have enough magic damage, which again is the default 3 physical, 2 magic, I will actually go into Genji's Guard very specifically, and I'm building that not only for the magic protections and the impressive 40 MP5, but also very specifically for the cooldown and the cooldown reduction of 3 seconds by the passive. Now, I've heard a couple of people over time say, well, the passive doesn't trigger often enough for that to be worth it. I mean, there's always at least, okay, I can't say always, but in 98% of matches, there's going to be some form of magic damage, and team fights don't often last longer than 30 seconds. Well, 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the team fight and the lateness of it. There have been I've had plenty of long team fights, but Genji's Guard is pretty consistent in its activation in the middle of team fights. I've never really had a problem with this not activating. So this is a really incredibly useful item because it's also going to hasten the amount of times that your ult is going to be online. Obviously, that is 3 seconds off of all of your abilities, right? So a lot of the times I am building something out of here. If I need anti-healing, I will go instead for Pestilence at this point. But other than that, usually my default is Genji's Guard. Then for the fifth item, this is really going to depend on a couple of different factors. Now, my go-to is, and I forgot to put it in here for some unholy reason, my go-to is Pridwin at this particular point for 2 reasons. One, the cooldowns. Well, actually 3 reasons. First is the cooldowns. Second is the combined protections. Third is the passive. Of course, this is a damaging passive, obviously. And we also have the 65 protections from Thebes, so we're going to be eking out slightly more damage from Pridwin's passive as a result of that, making up for the lack of defensive item we'll be using for our last item slot. So I find this very effective, especially when combined with the ult, because you can throw down the ult, and some players are afraid of leaving the pillars, because if you don't know, the Dharmic pillars, we're going to save this for a hot second, these Dharmic pillars that reduce the enemy protections, there are 4 pillars in a square formation, and there are glowing lines between the pillars, and anytime an enemy touches those lines, they lose their protections and they get slowed. As a result of that, some people just don't leave that square. And this is a great opportunity to practically guarantee that the Pridwin passive explosion is going to hit them. And if they are touching one of the lines, or if you position the pillars so that way the line starts underneath that person and they move into the line as a reaction, then you're going to be hitting a little harder than normal. Additionally, because they're going to have next to no protections, unless they're the tank or the solo. So you actually get to unload a really nice burst of damage in combination with your ult when you use it, because this shield from Pridwin activates the instant you've thrown down your pillars, right? Boom. That's it. The pillars show up, your shield comes up. This also gives you a little bit of a health shield that you can use to take advantage of your Dharmic pillars a little bit more by being able to go in there with your dash, silence some people. It gives you a bit more leeway, because a lot of players, Another reaction I've seen very commonly to the Dharmic Pillars is for the enemies to just unload AoE ults on the pillars. Now, how effective that is depends on how much your allies focus in on that area. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But you're probably going to be in the middle of that, and this health shield can help with that if that is the response of the enemies to the Dharmic Pillars, and that's going to depend on the enemies. Sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you won't. It doesn't hurt to have the health shield either way. So this is my fairly go-to, but if the enemy team has a particular focus on a specific damage type, I might go for a bit more dedicated protections. For example, for physical heavy comps, I have been known to grab Breastplate of Valor in those particular situations, or if I'm facing off against a lot of magic damage sources, I have also been known to grab Oni Hunter's Garb on occasion, if I don't already have Genji's Guard, which usually I do. So, and again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'll build a Witchblade if the enemy team has enough auto-attackers, which really depends on the team composition and if I really feel like going into that, but this is also something I will occasionally build in my 5th slot. But my go-to is Pridwin, right? And now for the delightful, the glorious, and the momentous damage item, because I mentioned earlier one of the great things about Ganesha is how much increased damage he can bring to bear, and I talked about Voidstone a little bit as an option here, but I want to talk to you about 3 very specific items that I've found unusually effective on Ganesh. The first, and my personal favorite, is Spear the Magus. You're already reducing enemy protections and you're already boosting allied damage. Why not then increase the damage enemies are taking? Now this combos obviously extremely well with the Dharmic Pillars, because that's going to refresh every time they step on it. Additionally, it is going to give you some flat penetration, so what few protections are left over, you yourself are going to be punching through. And finally, 12% magical lifesteal has never hurt a support, especially when you are doing increased damage via the reduced protections. So this is one of my favorite damage items to splash in on Ganesh at the end. It has a surprisingly significant impact. Let me just throw this in the build here and then talk to you about the scaling. We have 40% magic power here, which isn't that great. 45%, which isn't that great, but still pretty close to almost half. And this is 55%. So you're doing approximately half. So you're increasing your damage by roughly 50 points of damage, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a 6-second long thing that is going to theoretically be hitting every tick, which I think is half a second. So this can hit up to 12 times, 50 damage times 12 times, if I remember what a tick is correctly. That's a lot of damage, right? We're talking like 600 extra damage, which isn't bad. So Spear the Magus is one of my favorite items to splash at the end, but it is not the only one I've found effective. Now, I mentioned earlier that my team being unusually high damage generally causes me to go with Sovereignty a lot of the times. Well, Pythagoras' Peace is also fairly good for that, especially if I do have a lot of auto-attackers, and this is generally the big adjustment I'll make for if my team has a lot of auto-attackers, because they're going to get lifesteal, and they're going to get 10% lifesteal, and that is 10% off of their auto-attack damage. So if I have a lot of auto-attackers on my team, build Pythagoras' Peace, you're going to give them 20 more damage per shot, on top of what they're already building, plus an additional 10% healing off their shots, which is great. And furthermore, your magic damage sources get a bit of a boost as well. You get some cooldown, which is fantastic. You yourself get some lifesteal. You actually get 24% lifesteal. You get a little bit of magic power, not enough to write home about, and some health. This is a great item for those specific situations. And again, if my team has an unusually high number of auto-attackers, this is a great item that I will typically build in those situations. Hugely effective. Also, if you happen to be playing Assault, this is my go-to for that as well. Incidentally. Just an absolutely amazing item in that very specific situation. So basically, if you want a summarization between these two items, Spear the Magus or Pythagoras' Peace, auto-attacks, in auto-attack heavy team comp, your auto-attack heavy team comp, Pythagoras' Peace. If your team comp is ability-based, Spear the Magus. Why is this? Well, I already explained why Pythagoras' Peace is particularly effective for auto-attacking. That doesn't really need much more explanation. But for Spirit of the Magus, you have to keep in mind that abilities essentially are pulling damage from two different sources. The flat damage, or the baseline default damage of the ability, and also the scaled damage, which is additional damage based on the power of that person. Which means abilities, generally speaking, hit pretty damn hard, right? So both of those are being increased by the 7.5% increased damage. Now, for reference, I'm not saying that those are calculated separately. They are not. They are calculated as one damage number, okay? But that is one big damage number being increased by an additional 7.5%. So Spirit of the Magus tends to increase the damage from abilities a little bit more than the damage from auto attacks, because you have to dedicate pretty hard to an auto attack build, and you're also looking for attack speed there as well. But again, a lot of auto attackers typically scale very highly off of their power. We're talking physical auto attackers, or a select number of mages who have good auto attacks, such as Soul or Chronos, who have, one way or another, via their passive in Soul's case, or one of their abilities in Chronos' case, as examples, they can pull higher magic scaling off of their power into their auto attacks, making that very much still in line with Pythagoras' piece. So generally, these are my go-to damage items depending on my composition. But there is a third item, Ethereal Staff. Now, Ethereal Staff is fairly interesting, and I only build this if the enemy team composition happens to be absurdly tanky, say, back in the old days with the man teams, as they were called, which was just 5 warriors and guardians, and/or, right? Some mixture of warriors and guardians was the entirety of the enemy team composition. It's not very balanced in terms of the early game is stupid strong, but the late game they tend to fall off. Yeah, well, part of the reason why the late game they tend to fall off is because there's a lot of percentage of health effects that are devastating in the late game, and one of these is Ethereal Staff. Stealing away 6% of the person's health can really hurt a tanky comp's ability to survive. And since you're pulling that yourself, this also makes you nearly impossible for a tank composition who already are going to do baseline lower damage. It's going to be even more difficult for them to kill you, right? So against abnormally tankier compositions, Ethereal Staff can really pull a lot of weight here by basically draining off a lot of that maximum health, which really helps in the short term of your average team fight against tank-heavy compositions. So this is generally how I approach building Ganesh, right? And to kind of summarize, we've got this for the protections here, and then we've got, let's go with, I'm sure, what probably a lot of people will be very interested in looking at. Let's go with Mystical Mail, right? We have Pridwin, we have the replacement for that, and then we have to grab our sample Genji's Guard. You can see we've got some really great protections. Hold on, I actually need to grab really quickly Sentinel's Boon here. Right? Now, you might be thinking, well, Professor, you're not breaking 300. No, I'm not breaking 300. Right? Although, yeah, we have Pridwin. I was going to say we don't have Pridwin, and we do have Pridwin. It was just out of order. Honestly, at these levels of protection, you really don't need that much more. Executioner, Voidstone, of course, Demonic Grip. There's all kinds of things. Soul Reaver, Chin Size, Heartseeker. Protections don't mean quite as much as they used to. There is a huge variety of ways to either punch through or circumnavigate completely protections. So, while normally I do like to get up to 300-ish, I find that a lot of times there's really not a huge difference there, right? I mean, consider, for example, 40% full pen, right? We're going to assume a 40% full penetration, because I actually want to talk about this because I haven't talked about this in a hot minute, and it's good to remind people, and it's also good for the new people who don't know, right? Now, let's say an enemy's coming at me with 40% penetrations. If I have 100 protections, that is 40 gone. So now we're talking that I'm basically playing with 60 protections against that particular person. If I had 200 protections, then I'm basically losing, obviously, 80, so I'm playing like I have 120. Now, in case you didn't know, there's an actual in-game formula, and I'm not going to go over it here because maths. A lot of people don't like maths, and I'm not going to bore you with the maths. But at 100 protections even, assuming no penetration, you are mitigating 50% of that damage. So at 120 protections, you're already mitigating still over half of that damage incoming. At 300 protections, now a 40% penetration then becomes 120, and that brings your protections to 180. There's only really a 60 protection difference there, and that's assuming maximum 40% penetration, which almost nobody builds. The average amount of penetrations people build, for reference, is approximately 20%. Executioner is a rare exception, and is a very appropriately scary item for a lot of supports. Probably the only item I fear and loathe as a support. But by and large, the average amount of penetrations people are going to be building is 20%. That is the average. Some people go a little bit more aggressive with that. Some people don't build any at all. Some people build just 10%. It really depends on the individual. But the average player only builds 20% penetrations, plus one form of flat penetration, which tends to run 10 to 20 flat penetrations on top of that. So as a result, getting capped or overcapping your protections really isn't that important. All right. I generally try to shoot for somewhere from 250 to 300, somewhere between there, which I've hit here, and this is generally what I try to aim for. This is actually why my last item tends to be some form of damage item that also helps my allies. This is why, right? Because going all the way like from 250 to like 300, in all honesty, it's not going to make that big of a difference in terms of your survivability, because another thing that a lot of people either aren't aware of or forget very frequently because of the way it's structured is that there is diminishing returns on protections. All right, the more protections you have, the less of a difference it makes in your survivability. Right, as I mentioned before, when you have 100 protections even of a particular damage type, that damage type coming at you with no penetration involved, that is 50% damage. At 200 protections, you're taking 25%. Right? All right? That is the mitigation over time. It's really not that big of a deal to have more than 250, and I only recommend a minimum of 250 or approximately 250 for the sake of penetrations, because at 250 with 20% penetrations, right, you're talking about 50 being pulled away. Now you're left with approximately 200, and now you're taking only approximately a quarter of the incoming damage, right? Again, Executioner and percentage of health effects get around this, but with those exceptions, you're taking only about a quarter of the incoming damage, right? This is the point of being tanky. So it's not generally worth going all the way to 300, because in most cases it's not going to be worth it. Again, if there's an obscene amount of auto attackers that are building Executioner, maybe that's a different conversation. But there are ways around that as well. Witchblade, Midgardian Mail, which is what I talked about earlier. Okay? But this is why I also advocate for splashing in a single damage item at the end of the game, because also at the end of the game, when your ability damage isn't what it used to be, again, I mentioned pretty frequently that Guardians hit decently hard in the early game, and that falls off as the game goes on because they're not adding on that scaling like mages are in most cases. Throwing in a single damage item at the end of the game is going to give you a fighting chance if you do wind up alone, or if you're caught by yourself for some reason. Maybe you're on your way to the Gold Fury to check it, make sure no one's trying to take that, and you get ambushed, right? It happens. Sometimes you're just caught unawares alone. In those cases, you're going to want just a little bit of damage to at least do enough damage to scare the enemy, which you'd be surprised. One good slap from a support, while it won't win you any duels, obviously, it can scare a lot of people, because they're like, whoa, hold on. I wasn't expecting this amount of damage from a support, and they'll back off for a second. They'll realize, after a brief second later, obviously, that it's the support. What are they going to do, right? It's a support alone. But that 1 second is all you really need to either reposition or get closer to your allies so that way you can lure them in, right? It happens to me so often where I can use that particular situation to lure enemies into a team fight that they wouldn't want, because once I slap them really hard once, ooh, they hesitate, and that's all I need to create some distance. They chase, my allies show up, things go down, right? But that's why I advocate for that, and this is a this was a great opportunity to talk about that, and this is also really the great thing about Gauntlet of Thebes is that because it is 65 of each protection, and obviously this doesn't even actually fully show that, because obviously Mantle of Discord is 55 of each protection, so actually it would be 278 and 272. Nevertheless, Gauntlet of Thebes really allows you a little bit more leeway in that, and actually is a great example of also how wicked overkill it can sometimes be when combined with a full defense build, right? So that's what, besides obviously talking about Ganesh, that is what I also really wanted to talk about here. Now, you see Tainted Steel here. This is something I'll build in non-conquest modes if there's a lot of healing on the enemy team. Well, I say non-conquest modes. I still tend to build Sentinel's Gift / Sentinel's Boon in Slash, but in a lot of other modes, I have been known to build Tainted Steel if the enemy team has a lot of healing, because obviously healing in such modes as Joust or Arena is much more difficult to deal with, because it tends to start earlier, it tends to be more problematic earlier, and it tends to, in Arena and Joust, enemies tend to cluster up faster. Obviously, in Joust, there's only 3 of them, but in Arena, it's just a giant team fight all the time. So, Tainted Steel becomes a bit more of a necessity in those game modes than, say, Slash or Conquest, which are longer. Enemies don't group up as quickly or as early, and healing isn't as immediately problematic. Yes, healing will eventually become a problem, but by that time, you will be able to build either Pestilence or Contagion according to your preference. But Tainted Steel is something I will build in the shorter game modes, because typically healing becomes much more of a serious problem there, also in Assault as well. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.